Welcome back to Law and Crime, everybody. I'm Jesse Weber, and thanks for joining us. Happy Halloween to everybody. A lot of things happening. Let's get started. Okay, lot to talk about, and what a panel I have with me. I have with me attorney Terri Austin back with me. I have with me trial attorney David Ring, and I also have with me former prosecutor and trial attorney Debbie Hines. So many attorneys. I feel a little intimidated by all this. I feel like I'm under a cross-examination of some way, but it's going to be okay. Debbie, I want to start with you as a former prosecutor. How should I say this? How would you actually present the testimony of Jane Doe number one? I say that because it is believed that her testimony might have been the weakest and the most controversial, but she holds 3 big counts for the state. What would you do in this upcoming trial in relation to Jane Doe number one?
So let me first say, as a former prosecutor, the one thing that we don't like having is to have a retrial. And the reason is because they're very difficult, because you have the transcript of what she said before. So in answering your question directly, what we need to do, what I would need to do as a former prosecutor, is to make sure that she understands exactly what she said in her testimony before, because that's what's going to be nitpicked apart for her. Her credibility is key. And like you say, she's holding 3 counts that are necessary for the state to convict on. And unfortunately, witnesses' memories wane and wean back and forth, so it's not really clear if she will be able to remember exactly what she said or if everything that she said is exactly as it happens. But I would just basically go over everything with her that she's already said, try to clear up anything that she may have said that may not have been exactly what she meant, because it's one thing when you're reading a transcript over to a witness, and another thing as opposed to what they actually thought they said on the witness stand. So those are really key, because credibility is everything in a rape case, and credibility will be everything in this case for this particular victim.
Absolutely. That's all about the Jane Does. David, let me ask you this. On one hand, with the prosecution, it seems advantageous to them to try all of these counts together, all of these different Jane Does together, really supports a pattern, and they even instructed the jury in the last trial that you can use evidence from one of the events of Jane Doe to help you determine about another Jane Doe. Having said that, the other side of it is if you have 1 or 2 of the Jane Does who don't seem so credible, doesn't that hurt the credibility of the other Jane Does? I say this to you because as we go into the retrial, theoretically, they don't need Jane Doe number 3 or Jane Doe number 5's testimony anymore, since their counts have been either concluded or dismissed. Do they call every Jane Doe back or not? What do you think?
Well, Jesse, look, I think that I don't think it does make Jane Doe number 1 any less credible, and want to surround her with other victims. And I think that's what the prosecution is going to do. They're going to put on at least 3, 4, 5 of these victims. And sure, Jane Doe number 1 appears to be the weakest link, but she's going to be bolstered by these other women. And so that's going to assist the jury to say, okay, she may not be the greatest witness in the world, but she's not alone. And we know this guy apparently did it to some other women. So that's going to bolster the case. But there's absolutely pros and cons of putting on the case this way, for sure.
Absolutely. And look, with Jane Doe number 1, her daughter was called to the stand. There was first an argument back and forth about her testimony. And I want to play that right now. This was actually an argument in front of the judge about Jane Doe number 1's daughter, who ultimately testified. And that's something that the defense exploited later on in the case. Terri, what were your thoughts on that? Because the defense really tried to strike at the credibility of this daughter and saying that this was, she wasn't coming out forward with the best of intentions. What do you think about that?
I think that putting that information into trial is definitely going to weigh on the jury. The jury's going to think this gives some credence to what the victim is saying. The daughter is trying to raise money. And I do believe that it will help as far as that's concerned. If I were the defense, I would not want that in, and I would absolutely argue to keep it out, because I think it does show that it wasn't just the victim who's claiming this, but the victim had discussions with her family, and that definitely bolsters the case right there.
Yeah, I think we actually have that GoFundMe page up if you want to just take a look. So it's right there. Debbie, let me ask you this. That seemed to be a big point for the defense. Remember, there was a deadlock for each one of the counts related to Jane Doe number 1. It's more of a win for the defense than it was for the state. Let me ask you, what did the defense do right, in your opinion, in this case?
Well, the defense did what every defense does. They created the reasonable doubt, and we don't know exactly, without speaking to the jurors specifically, what it was that created the doubt, but that's what happens whenever there is a mistrial. You've created some form of doubt. I mean, with the witness, of the victim, the doubt can be created just by saying that she has some form of mental health issues, because that all goes to, again, the credibility of the victim in the case. And anything that just chips and chips away at the credibility, however slight the chipping can be, that goes to the heart of the prosecutor's case. And let me just say that in all rape cases, they're very, very, very difficult because they always turn on the credibility of the witness. So we don't know what exactly was the deciding point in the last jurors' minds, but anything that the defense can do to chip away at the credibility of the rape victim is crucial, and it's key. And honestly, it's not that difficult to do, unfortunately, because there's always doubt in the minds of many jurors as to what really did happen with respect to a rape, particularly when there's no physical evidence, because people want to see physical evidence of some sort.
Yeah, we talked about it earlier about how sometimes when you report these incidents also comes into play in terms of credibility, which is unfortunate, but it is something that comes into the mind, you have to imagine, of jury members. David, considering the defense, they did lose on 3 counts. He was found guilty. He could face 9 years in prison, but it's not as bad as it could have been if he was found guilty across the board. Their goal is to make sure he doesn't be found guilty across the board, because he could theoretically spend the rest of his life in prison. The question, of course, is do they change anything up by the defense? Because again, getting those deadlocks is maybe more of a win for them than it was for the state. Obviously, they want the not guilty verdict, but do they change something up about what they did? And if so, what should they change?
Well, look, I think the defense goes in with the exact same tactic they had the first trial, and that's to pick apart each of these victim stories. And so now they have the advantage of having testimony from the first trial. So they have, if one of these witnesses, one of these Jane Does, goes a little astray and somehow is inconsistent with something she said in the first trial, you can be guaranteed these defense lawyers are going to stand up and say, hey, you said this in the first trial or under oath before, and now you're changing your testimony. So they have that advantage in this second retrial. I think what's going to be really interesting is, and there'll be speculation about this, does Kellen Winslow take the stand in this trial? Now, I would think he probably does not. But again, that's a game time decision based upon how they think this thing is playing out over the course of the trial.
Some interesting perspectives from my guest today about this really interesting case. We're going to take a break right now and focus when we come back on Jane Doe number 2. Stay tuned.